Welcome to the CASIS Vancouver and CIC joint event called Security, Intelligence, and African Perspectives on a Post-COVID Environment. My name is Natalie Architowski, and I'm the Deputy Executive Officer for Institutional Liaison and the Capability Assessor for CASIS Vancouver. And I would first like to acknowledge that we are on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. A quick breakdown before we get into today's event. We will begin with a short introduction to the CIC from Brett Shearing, as well as an introduction to CASIS from Candace Kelshall, and then we will go into our discussion panel with our speakers. After that, Brett will be moderating the discussion with each speaker, and a general question and answer period will be present at the end. Throughout the event, please submit your questions as we go along, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the event. Today, we will have Candace Kelshall speaking on police accountability. Sarah Myers will be speaking on Decoded, Understanding the Post-COVID Environment Using Structured Analytical Techniques. And Patrick Neal will be speaking on Technology and Privacy. And Amanda Makoso will be speaking on the Regeneration Perspectives on COVID-19 from the African continent, a report being released today as well. Thank you. First, Brett is originally from Vancouver and has a Bachelor's of Arts in International Relations from the University of British Columbia. He's an experienced political analyst, having worked in senior leadership positions on provincial and federal campaigns and in the Canadian Federal Parliament. Brett was first elected to the executive board of the Vancouver branch of the CIC in 2017 and was elected president to a one-year term in 2019. In his professional life, Brett works as a research manager at a risk management and due diligence firm, engaging with predominantly international clients. In his role, he specializes in geopolitical analysis and leads the Anglophone and European regional research team. Brett, please take it away.
Thanks a lot, Natalie. Yeah, my name's Brett. I'm the president of the CIC Vancouver branch. I just wanted to thank everyone for coming today. And as well as thank every member of the CASIS team in Vancouver for doing amazing work putting this event together. It's always a real pleasure getting to put on events with CASIS, and this event serves as an excellent cross-platform for both of our memberships, the public at large to gain some nuances on a really important topic. Just following up on the land acknowledgement that you stated, Natalie, I think this is a really topical time to be talking about policing in our society, particularly with regards to Black Lives Matter movement, and the understanding that these topics have disproportionately affected Indigenous and peoples and people of color in Canada. So I think that we're going to have a great session. I look forward to it. The CIC is CIC Vancouver is one of the original 5 branches of the CIC, originally founded in 1928. We're a multidisciplinary think tank that focuses on international relations and global affairs. And just for our CIC members that are currently on, and for CASIS members that would like to know a bit more about CIC, we're currently endeavoring to do what we call the Global Ambition Project, to have a citizen-driven forum on reshaping Canadian foreign policy in a time when we have been a little bit adrift with regards to especially the loss of the Security Council. So it's a project that we're really excited about, and it should be coming out soon. And just lastly, I wanted to say that for all the CIC members that are on the call right now, if you are based in Vancouver, I would encourage you to follow more about CASIS events and become a member of their organization. And obviously would encourage members of CASIS to do the same for us. For both of our memberships, there's a mutual discount. So the time is now. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the event.
Thank you, Brett. Next, I would like to introduce Candace Kelshall. She is the president of the CASIS Vancouver chapter, and she is a seasoned in-theater operational director and has worked extensively with militaries and advising police forces around the world. She has delivered training in 17 different countries. She has 30 years experience in diplomacy, law enforcement, and military professional training, and 10 years as a military and police advisor in the UK. She previously served as a diplomat, naval officer, and specialist advisor and consultant in disaster response, critical incident and terrorist response, national emergency management, and multi-agency joint operations architecture, as well as training design for intelligence fusion centers, special forces units, and national operations centers. She is currently teaching at Simon Fraser University as an adjunct professor of criminology and a member of the Canadian Network for Research on Terrorism, Security, and society. Candice?
And I still look as young as a daisy with all of that. Thank you for being with us here today. Thank you very much to CIC for asking us to come on board and talk a bit about security issues around the current new normal environment. In CASIS Vancouver, the last 3 months have been possibly the busiest time that we've had. We've converted everything we do online, including an upcoming conference in November, which will be a first for us. But I'm really pleased that we have the opportunity to talk a bit about some of the research we've been doing over the course of the last 3 months, in particularly the launch of Decoded, which is our COVID structured analytical technique analysis and regeneration, which is a text that is very special to me. It is a book co-authored by Amanda Makoso, in which we listen to young intelligentsia from across the African continent, because I think this is a seminal moment for the African continent. It's almost a constructivist moment, if you will, for the continent to step forward and define itself in its own voice. And I love the opportunity that we've taken to have those young voices express themselves. So the regeneration document is written by generation Y and Z, millennials and Gen Zs, basically, and it's very exciting for us. So thank you for inviting us here today.
Fantastic. Finally, my next job is to introduce the speakers. So we will start with Sarah Myers. Sarah has co-edited the Addressing of Normalization of Extremism, the prepared textbook, alongside Candice Kelshall, where she currently at CASIS, where she currently serves as the director of the prepared educational program. She also holds positions of Deputy Executive Officer and Head of Publications for CASIS Vancouver, and is a research analyst at the Canadian Centre for Identity-Based Conflict. We also have Dr. Patrick Neal. Dr. Patrick Neal has been involved in justice and public safety field since 1982. In 2010, he became the Crime and Intelligence Analysis Program Coordinator in the Forensic Science and Technology Department at the British Columbia Institute of Technology. Throughout his career, he has used data and information to develop better responses to justice and public safety incidents, inform policy development, develop insights into how people search for and use data and information. He recently completed his PhD thesis in 2019 on active cyber deterrence and protecting the information society. And finally, we have Amanda Makoso. She completed her master's degree of arts and political science from Simon Fraser University and holds a second master's degree in marketing and business intelligence and a bachelor's degree in law. Previously, she has worked at the Canadian Journal of Development Studies. She has served as the director of the Defense and Security Advisory Network at CASIS Vancouver, where she facilitated the communication of academics' research projects. Amanda's current focus is on exploring juvenile terrorist recruitment in sub-Saharan Africa. I will now pass everything along to Brett, who will begin our discussion portion of the evening.
Thank you. So what I'll be doing is I'll be asking all of our speakers a series of questions with regards to the work that they've been doing, more recently with the publications that have recently come out. This is always a pleasure for me because one of the best things about the CIC CASIS partnership is having the expertise of CASIS with regards to security matters at our fingertips. So it's a real pleasure for me to get to ask these questions to people that have so much experience in the field. Candice, I'll start off by asking you a couple questions. Basically, high level, what is policing accountability and what should it achieve?
Well, I think that's a question that's being asked pretty much around the world in every country that we can see this on a daily basis. It's a great question and one that a lot of people are struggling over. I spent 10 years working with the Metropolitan Police and with the British Transport Police as a critical incident advisor and an independent police advisor. And that 10 years of that experience going on in operations, working alongside police officers, doing consultations, I think accountability comes down to some very simple core concepts, one of which is taking responsibility for actions. And I think one of the things we might ask ourselves is, is it fair to ask that police practice be benchmarked against an expected standard of professional behavior and professional conduct? And might that be something that we would want to see instituted internationally, so that it's no longer an issue of individual precincts or individual countries or states or provinces having different standards of accountability? I think that might help us in terms of understanding what we want out of police forces. And I think the deeper answer to that question would be, at the end of the day, that we want trust. We want to be able to trust our police forces. And that's an easy solution from a policing perspective. If we can ensure that the police are accountable, legal and lawful and proportionate in their activities, then I think, trust comes from that. I think one other consideration might be looking at ensuring that police officers are behaving in a population-centric versus an enemy-centric way, and that means losing the whole warrior ethos that currently exists, which we're seeing played out on our television screens. So, I mean, in a nutshell, that's how I would define police accountability.
Interesting. I mean, obviously, we're living in a time where that trust factor with police and law enforcement is at the forefront of questions about it as an institution. So what solutions do you see as being the most likely to be effective for reforming or improving police? Is it defunding, such as kind of the current groundswell movement? Is it improved training? Is it a restructuring of the institution itself? What methods do you see as being potentially successful?
Well, ultimately, I think the answer to that is twofold. I think in the first instance, it's got to be training related. It's about how we train, who we select, who we choose to be police officers, and a clear understanding of what is expected from them. There can be a police killing can be lawful, can be conducted under the guidelines and practices that have been set out by a police force, and yet not be acceptable socially, ethically, or morally by the communities that the police serve. And that is because police are effectively separated from the communities that they serve, because they are protected with answering to and for their responsibility through unions and different methods by which they are not necessarily held to account. One of the ways that happens is the concept of oversight. I've always maintained that oversight is inappropriate. And when I say that, that sounds like a strange thing to say. Oversight tends to be after the fact. It tends to be once something has happened, we assess something and say where it went wrong. But once something is broken, it can't be fixed again. And so I've always taken the position that it's not oversight that's needed to help with police accountability, but rather it's with sight, so that you have independent police advisors, you have members of the community who have an understanding of what policing entails and spend time embedded as critical friends within police forces. I think then you get the benefit of with sight, so that police officers can actually use these independent advisors who come from the communities that they're policing, and while policing is unfolding, get the benefit of suggestions for how decisions are being made for policing particular communities. So I think the whole idea of responsibility and accountability coming after the fact is problematic. I think that should happen before an operation and during an operation, with input from communities alongside police to help with that. And of course, as I said, training is key. Independent police advisors can't overstate the importance of that role. They're almost like having a human structured analytical technique working alongside a police officer, helping with decision making, because that way you remove the cognitive bias that comes that when you're a police officer and you've always been a police officer, you only see things from a police officer's eyes. If you have a member of the community standing next to you asking questions while you're making decisions, then you begin to see things differently, or from the perspective of a different part of the community, and in that way, you help remove some of that cognitive bias. So I think training and having critical incident advisors who are members of the community will go a long way in helping that with sight, being removing accountability from after the fact, but to during and while something is unfolding.
Interesting. It's a big topic, and one that I'd like to delve into a little bit further. My duties as a moderator compel me to move along to our next speaker, but we might double back on that in the Q&A section at the very end. I'll now move over to ask Sarah a couple questions. The first one, what are key takeaways from the recent COVID SAT report, and what role do structured analytic techniques have in assisting with the findings that were contained in that report?
Thank you, Brett. Okay, yes, this first question. We have centered our book, Decoded, Understanding the Post-COVID-19 Environment Using Structured Analytic Techniques, around the use of SATs, aka structured analytic techniques, and SMATs, or SMATs, which are structured models and analytic techniques. And these models are slightly different from SATs because they use social science theories as a basis for subject matter evidence, which is incorporated into their theoretical framework for the models which are applied. So this allows analysts to, when they're encountering new challenges, to complete analysis without the express need of an expert to aid in the assessment. And our SMATs, we created 3. And the one that we used specifically for kind of generating the issues that we focused our case studies on in this book is the discord model. And when we use the discord model to look at what was happening with this pandemic around the world, it generated 6 issues. So these 6 key issues are food security, extremism, misinformation, human security, transportation and infrastructure, and economic policy. And it was really important for us to be able to utilize these techniques because they take away bias and they're able to help us generate intelligence briefs that can be utilized by policy or decision makers moving forward when they're looking at different ways to address this particular issue. Specifically, the overarching security question that we asked ourselves when we were writing up this report was, how might the security landscape experience change internationally following the COVID-19 pandemic? So it was quite important to us in order to then move forward using the rest of the SATs and SMATs, that we knew that we were able to look at these different case studies from an unbiased point of view, using both a local and global perspective on these issues instead of staying in a Western perspective.
Okay, interesting. And so from this publication, what were some key judgments that came from the publication that may assist law enforcement and policymakers in their effort to address this shift in the security and policing landscape that is likely to be entailed from COVID-19?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we were able to come up with 4 analytic judgments that really encompassed all of the intelligence briefs that were generated throughout this report. So as we were looking at the results of the SATs and SMATs, the 4 analytic judgments that appeared were, the first one was consistent messaging is key for weathering the pandemic. And this one was of particular importance when we were looking at government officials in different regions or nations and the ways in which having inconsistent messaging negatively affected this crisis and the pandemic, and also civic discord and how people were reacting negatively to different policy initiatives, etc., for the given situation. Our second analytic judgment was power and influence dynamics are changing on an international scale and within nations. So this was particularly interesting, especially when we looked at case studies from Taiwan and other regions that were effectively having their economic placement internationally change because of the negative effects of the virus in the current superpowers transnationally. So when these big changes are happening on a global scale, they're affecting the ways in which different nations are interacting with each other, as well as when we look at regions such as the European Union, how different states within those regions are reacting to one another with regard to policies and the different economic issues that were coming up because of the pandemic. Our third analytic judgment was resilience, creativity, and collaboration are key to successfully emerging from the pandemic. So when we're trying to focus on what a post-COVID-19 international landscape looks like, we have to understand the different characteristics that should be taken on in order to see a more smooth and successful reintegration to normal society and what that new normal looks like. So when we were looking at the different case studies, we found consistently that regions and nations that were collaborating with one another, creating different techniques and ways to deal with the situation, the pandemic in different neighborhoods, etc. And those that focused on the negatives versus those that were at least attempting to be resilient in this time, you saw the difference in how they were able to mitigate all of the negative consequences of this virus. So that was particularly important. And our final analytic judgment was misinformation creates ungovernable spaces in social cohesion. And this was something that isn't necessarily the main focus when we're watching the news. However, because of the focus of our research here at CASIS Vancouver, we look at extremism and the ways in which it is manifesting transnationally. And what we've seen is there is a significant rise in extremist activity as the result or the opportunity that the pandemic has provided them with regard to a focus on online communities, as well as citizens having less trust in their governments and their officials. So it's provided quite an opportunity for extremist messaging and narratives to take hold. So those were our four main aspects that we believe decision makers and policymakers internationally, because this was found globally, if they were to take these into consideration, they might have a better shot at having an effective plan for this pandemic.
Yeah, and in a world where we use platitudes around COVID-19, like these unprecedented times and these uncertain and challenging times, it seems like there are a lot of tangibles coming out of that report that'll be really interesting to come back to towards the end of the presentation. Thank you very much, Sarah. I'm going to move on to asking Patrick some questions. Patrick, the first one for you, and we're talking about the topic of technology and privacy with regards to a post-COVID-19 landscape. What are some areas in the world that we as Canadians should be paying attention to in regards to the state and non-state actors' response to the threat of privacy in a post-COVID-19 world?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. And I'm going to pick up on the theme that Sarah brought up and Candace brought up, and that is this idea of a digital divide and who's going to get affected by it. I suspect it's going to be Africa as they come into the largest infrastructure, building out technology as they move forward. And then following that very quickly, this is going to sound odd for a moment, but it will be United States and the Caribbean. And why I pick on these three is that United States is so deeply entrenched with technology, but you're seeing a lot of the emergence of different kinds of technological frameworks influencing privacy opportunities. So with Africa, you have this huge onboarding of technology that's very hard to control the privacy functionality. And I think this digital divide is going to drive that even further. But the key problem that we face here is that we have to understand that if we keep talking about countries, we're going to get stuck in the problem of geopolitics. And one of the key things that happens is these extremist groups, these extremists that Sarah referred to, and you're going to hear more about it from Amanda, is that they will adopt this technology much more aggressively, and they'll be at the edge of finding every way possible to breach that privacy. And I think this is where we have to be extremely cautious of saying, yeah, privacy is here, and worry about the countries, when in fact it may not be the state actors, it may be non-state actors who have more influence than we give them credit for.
Mm-hmm. And there's going to be a lot of security threats coming out of, you know, a reshifted world, you know, impacted by COVID-19. In your opinion, what do you think the greatest threat to technology and the greatest threat to privacy emerging in a post-COVID-19 environment?
So the threat, it's going to be something that we've already been talking about in the last few years, but it's gaining funding and it's gaining attention from Gen Zs. And Candace referred to these groups earlier. And it's got to be really clear here is that privacy enhancement technologies are going to hit a price point and an access point on the market where the Gen Zs themselves, who will be the largest consumer of this market, will aggressively adopt it. And we're already starting to see that. They're choosing web browsers and they're choosing encryption engines to stay hidden and stay away from the technologies. So we're stuck with this idea of the technology, but I'm more concerned with artificial intelligence. And I'm more concerned with, and I think Candace brings this out quite nicely, is that oversight in AI and privacy is the wrong direction. It's definitely going to have to be the other way around. And this idea of being more advanced in understanding privacy as a fundamental day-to-day activity, not as a one-off privacy breach. And I think this is for some people who may be in the audience, if you are in that generation where you're under 25 and you're exploring this technology, you are in a position where you'll be one of the first generations to assume that privacy is built into your networks, and you're going to build it in and actually operationalize it. And this is a serious problem. We don't know what it can do. We don't know how far to push it. We don't know what teeth to give to our privacy commissioners. And we don't know what education kind of curriculums that actually helps us deal with AI and deal with privacy enhancements. Like, we don't know how these things are going to work together and whether or not we've put the genie out of the box already.
In the response to that question, there was a lot of different cogs in the wheel. There's a lot of different actors that were involved in the privacy landscape. And something that kind of struck me in that answer was, you know, we have, you know, the new generation being, you know, the first to take security, you know, seriously in their day-to-day lives and in their activities, you know, on the net and more broadly. In your opinion, do you think that you know, self-regulation and almost kind of grassroots-based emphasis on security solutions is going to be sufficient, or you know, are we up a creek, so to speak?
Well, I'll tread that one carefully. I don't think it will be sufficient, to be honest. The reality is that we're going to have to educate people to understand how privacy flows through their daily activity. We've put privacy as this cocoon that we walk around, but we haven't operationalized it in a way for the individual to say, I don't want all these privileges. I want to be able to control each one of my private rights, whatever those may be. The confusion, though, and I'll close off here quickly, and I just want to make sure we don't get off tracking for timing. My conclusion, though, is this. Is the Gen Z will become the largest population entering our workforce. It will become the largest population in academia if they even come to schools. This is going to be a huge problem for privacy operations, both internally inside companies and as state actors. And I bring up an issue around city actors and RWEs and those kind of agencies who are going to affect us because they're going to have the same technology and they're going to have the same ability to engineer their own unique privacy portfolio. And this has already been talked about in the European Union. I know it's been talked about in the Caribbean, to have your own capability. And this is really exciting for my position. So again, I got to be careful here. For me, the excitement is that privacy can come away from corporate models and come back to me and actually allow me to control it inside my device. And this is what we look for. This would be the ultimate, AI and privacy and my device. So, but thank you for the question, Brett.
Yeah, so overall, I have a little bit less than a minute to go into the focus here. But so basically, I guess I'll kind of ask a platitude question. You see some hope in the situation?
Yes, absolutely. Hope is perennial. There is software. I'm looking at a couple countries that are teaching their students how to deal with privacy, how to write code Spanish is no longer second language, and I apologize to my language instructors out there, but we actually should be teaching code, Java, Python, languages that help us to build a more resilient cyber citizen, a more resilient cyber society, because that's where we're going to be living, and we need to get a grip on that. And that's coming from an old Dodger like me who's still scared of these damn things.
Awesome, perfect. Thank you very much, Patrick. I'll now move on to asking Amanda a couple of questions. Amanda, we're talking about African perspectives with regards to COVID-19. So, from your position, what are some key takeaways from the recent publication, Regeneration, Perspectives on COVID-19 in the African Continent? I wonder if you can comment on that publication and its prescriptions.
Hello, everyone. So first of all, thank you, all of you, for being here. And like Candice mentioned, actually, is that this report really presents many perspectives across the African continent on literally the implication, or I would say the impact of COVID-19 on the African continent. So the authors basically share the perspectives on how COVID-19 is impacting the continent, but also many sectors within the continent. So the coronavirus is really affecting, workers, student refugees living in refugee camps, and police officers, and even actually officials from the government. But what is interesting, I think, about this report is that it tries to highlight what might explain Africa's resilience when it comes to dealing with this crisis. And COVID-19 has, of course, and literally that show, as this report shows, revealed the vulnerability of African nations' social infrastructures, and that's a fact. But at the same time, Africa was really expected to be hit really hard by this crisis, but the continent, I think, has arguably shown resilience in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. And this might, of course, be attributed, to the lessons learned from the Ebola crisis, where we already have populations that were already, that have survived from the Ebola crisis. So it was a little bit easier for them to be more prepared when it comes to COVID-19, but also from our report specifically, what our authors suggest is that, the modernization of existing technology or even local invention have helped actually many communities being more resilient to this crisis, but also state leadership in countries such as Rwanda or even Ghana. So, but beyond this resilience, there is a desire nonetheless to address the issues that the continent is facing. Because even prior to COVID-19, the continent was already facing poverty or hunger or food security, which might even increase or be amplified in a COVID-19 context or post-COVID-19. This is why our authors have highlighted, for instance, what kind of recommendations, what kind of communities we want to build in the future, what kind of, what are we expecting Africa to go in a post-COVID-19 environment, and where should we go actually? So some of them are focused more on, the economic side of it. Maybe we should focus on small businesses, on increasing, on focusing on local inventions. Maybe we should focus on diversifying our economy, especially when we are all dependent. And in this context, African post-COVID-19 world should really focus also maybe on regional integration. So all of that, I think, are just reflections that the author has brought, but I still think that in a post-COVID-19 world, all of us will need to redefine and to define what kind of communities and what kind of societies we want to build in Africa. But the COVID-19 situation that our authors really are talking about is not really just about the effects within the African continent, but also even just how COVID-19 is restructuring the relationship with the West when it comes to foreign aid. And also just even the students in those countries, we want better opportunities to come here. In a post-COVID-19 world, would it be possible for them to be able to come here for better opportunities, better education? So all of that are the questions that this report tried to highlight. But I think in a certain way, it has opened our eyes on not only our vulnerabilities, but there's still hope here, because we kind of seeing that although we are so vulnerable, but at the end of the day, we are able to mitigate this crisis that is happening in our own way. But just to conclude, I would just say that, you know, when it comes to COVID-19, or when it comes to health crisis in general, we're really fighting a virus. So in a post-COVID-19 world, as we'll talk a lot about you know, armed conflict in Africa. In a post-COVID-19 world, probably we will need to focus on those type of issues that could emerge, including violent group that might emerge, that might take advantage of the situation to further their agendas, or even provide social services to increase their legitimacy. But I still think in a post-COVID-19 world, we will need to think about dealing with this situation holistically. So even those are, because, you know, enhancing the health sectors is really important, should actually be a priority as investing in the military, because even those military forces fighting against extremism, or fighting against violent conflict, they will need to be healthy actually while doing so. Hence the necessity for us to really build a post-COVID-19 world where the focus is really on focusing on, the focus will be really on addressing the vulnerability of our health system, because, you know, if there's no health, there's no life, and if there's no life, there is just literally chaos. And I don't want to end this with this bad note. What I'm trying to say is that this report really shows the resilience of the African continent when it comes to dealing with this crisis, although it wasn't expected to. But at the end, we will need to address the issues that we've already faced, even prior to COVID-19. And this might be done with international cooperation, regional integration, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, a lot to think about. Thank you, Amanda. My second question I'm going to pull from the publication itself. I'm wondering if you can explain a bit more in detail about the role of grassroots organizations with regards to the impact of COVID-19 on the African.
Actually, how this publication does not focus on grassroots activism per se, but like some authors have suggested, local inventions have really been here to help modernization of technologies, and just the ingenuity of many of local populations has really helped. But what I've noticed when it comes to grassroots activism, it has really been about bringing awareness on the COVID-19 situation, specifically because we had some populations. It was really about those, especially women organizations in countries such as Sudan, were really focusing on making the population understand that there was a disease that was there, and that a disease that needed to be taken seriously. And so we have in other countries such as the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where we had activists literally going on street and talking to people to fight misinformation, because for some people, coronavirus was a rumor. And even one of our authors actually suggests that, talks about those rumors, especially in social media. So it was really about going back there and fighting the misinformation that was going around. But, you know, in the African context, it's really, I would say, really difficult and really hard, especially if you can go back to our talk, adversity quotient with Zan Verge, and she really mentions it. It's really about those people need food security is really something, and those people are thinking about the fact that the continent is you. What I'm trying to say is you putting restrictions on people while people, they need to go out to make sure that they can provide for their family. So although the best intentions can be here about putting restrictions, making sure that people understand that there is a danger here, but at the end, those are people that really need to be out there so they can go back and provide for their families. So it's true that what activists have done for the continent to bring awareness was really essential and important. But in the African context, it might have been challenging for them, especially when people were just not we're just not so receptive about those restrictions, where their livelihoods really depend on them being outside there, on them being able to go out so they can provide for their families.
Right, absolutely. Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you to all of our speakers. I'm going to pivot now to an open Q&A. A lot of questions have been coming in, so I'm going to do my best to field them as they come. I'd encourage everyone, if they have a question, to put it in the Q&A section. I'd also encourage all of our speakers, the questions I'll be asking will be directed at one or maybe two individuals, but I'd encourage all of our speakers, if they have anything to add to that question or add to the commentary, to please do so. So my first question is going to be for Candace. So you mentioned that policing with sight would be more beneficial than policing with oversight. The question is, how could this transition be made? And moreover, do you think it will contribute to increasing community trust of policing in a current time where defund the police is commonly heard?
I do, because with sight, I just coined the phrase like right now. With sight means that instead of the police taking actions unilaterally, engaging with the community in an aggressive stance, the opportunity is there for the community to contribute to their own policing by having key members of that community engaging with police prior to on an ongoing basis, so that there is a dialogue and understanding about what some of the changing social norms might be, and the police have the opportunity to engage in dialogue about, well, how do we police to those social norms when the law requires us to do certain things in the presence of certain types of actions. And that dialogue can't happen with batons on the street with a protest. That dialogue has to happen before the protest occurs, and it means engendering that relationship and that trust on an ongoing basis. So when I say with sight, I literally mean that we need to take this moment in time and engage with each other, both from a police perspective and a community leader perspective, so that we understand one another better. And we've seen an example of what that looks like. We've seen in Flint, Michigan, that police chief take off the baton, take off the body armor, and go walking with his community, and how the community embraced him. And the results speak for itself within that community in terms of discord or negative behavior. So I think very much the moment is now where we can start, and I use this word with consideration, we can start demanding for greater community involvement in policing our own communities. And we do that not by asking to defund police forces, because I don't believe that is the correct way forward. We do that by engaging with police forces and having a deeper relationship with them as community members. And that doesn't mean the police paying lip service to community engagement by putting up booths and stands at community events. It means taking people into policing trust, exposing them to policing training, letting them see how police officers make decisions and what decision-making tools look like in a policing capacity. And then that dialogue can begin at that point with, well, this is how my community would see this if you did that. And this is how my community would prefer to be policed. So that's what I mean by with sight, and that's how that would start. It's not just about training the police officers, it's also about training, if you will, community to engage in a more beneficial manner with the police that are charged with overseeing law and order.
Thank you, Candace. I'll ask a quick follow-up to that question. You said that you don't see defunding the police as the best way forward from a policy perspective. When we talk about defunding the police, there's a litany of different conceptions on how to do that. A common one at least being pivoting funding from police forces and kind of what have been characterized as kind of the militarization of police forces into community services. So do you think that has some merit, or do you think that police funding itself is not the problem, but the methods and tactics in which they're trained and operationalized?
You've answered that question yourself. Putting money into community services, absolutely. I mean, there is no circumstance in which that is a bad thing. But taking money away from police forces, that's not going to change the fact that the police force exists for a reason and a purpose, and that is to maintain law and order. What happens is if you complete if you completely look at closing down police forces and defunding completely, then that function still needs to occur within the society. It's the nature of the social contract that we have with the state. But we want to feel safe with the people who are stewarding the monopoly of violence for and on behalf of the state and charged with keeping law and order. And the only way that that can occur is not by defunding, but by using that money to train and possibly retrain police forces away from warrior ethos, enemy-centric perspectives and into more population-centric understandings. And that's where organizations like CASIS Vancouver can play a role in this process, because when you have the benefit of organizations that are doing research on what the nature of contemporary conflict looks like and how social movements are changing the way we need to be thinking about policing, we're moving away from independent rational decision maker models and the criminalization of communities and predictive policing, which is looking at past trends and patterns with crime. And we need to move into a different space, to make reference to Patrick's work. We need to move into a machine learning, AI, big data centric space where we're policing environment and not individuals. Because when something is occurring within the environment, we're better able to ensure that the police can resource appropriately rather than target individuals criminally. And that, I think, is where organizations like CASIS can help, because we're doing research into those areas and showing these developments and how social movements and the way social movements can communicate through technology. That is by design changing the way policing has to occur. It's no longer a 19th century policing platform that we know and have come to accept, but we need to move into something new, the 21st century policing platform, which requires a different approach.
Great. Thanks, Candice. I'll now pivot to ask a question for Amanda. Can you elaborate on the lessons learned from the Ebola crisis that the African continent may have implemented or utilized to be better prepared to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic?
So when I say that the population were more prepared, is because when Ebola came, there were literally preventive measures. So population, when they came, they already knew that when COVID-19 came, some communities were already just aware of the preventive measures, especially because when Ebola happens, there was a lot of misinformation. So what has helped also in the COVID-19 crisis is the fact that it was, first of all, a global pandemic. So the reality was here. Well, in some communities back in Africa, there were some people who didn't really believe in the Ebola, or there were a lot of misinformation around the Ebola crisis. So when COVID-19 came, because there were during the Ebola crisis, when there was this idea that we needed to think about prevention, those same idea, when they came in some community, it was just more easier for them to be receptive to that. But also we have, beside those preventive measures, we just have healthcare practitioners who were just more used. So it was, first of all, the communities themselves were more prepared because of some preventive measures that happened, because of the desire to fight misinformation, especially in the Ebola area, which happened also in the COVID-19, where it was really about, especially when I talk about grassroots activists, it was really about talking to the people and informing them on the reality of COVID-19, which might have helped for people to be more receptive, even if in some other places or community they were not. But the Ebola crisis helped in this sense. And because between when the 2014-2016 Ebola crisis happened, there were just health practitioners specifically were just more experienced when it comes to dealing with the Ebola crisis. So we have on one hand the community who were just more receptive when it came to addressing the COVID-19 situation, because they were already aware of what happened when Ebola was there. And then we have also health practitioners, because they have this experience from the Ebola crisis, and therefore they were just more able to provide services to the population. So basically, this is an overview, and this is the kind of lessons we learned from the Ebola crisis. But there was also the mention of the fact that when it came to Ebola, there was some community, because of there was really transmission due to some gatherings, especially a religious gathering that might happen, and that might also allow people to just be able to have this disease. But when COVID-19 happened, what we've seen in many countries in Africa is it was really about making sure that there were not large gathering, making sure that population were aware that there were a disease there. So, and then it was really important to focus literally on addressing not only misinformation, but making people understand, being more prepared when it comes to preventive measures.
Great, thank you, Amanda. Next up, I have a question for Patrick. Wondering if you can explain or further explain what you mean by Gen Z operationalizing their security.
Right. Currently, privacy is a passive event where you're asked to either opt in or opt out. Gen Zs are demanding and already starting to question the way to opt in and the way they opt out and what they're opting into, and being able to control that. The operationalization of it is going to occur when the Gen Zs start to write their own sets of instructions and demand that. An analogy I can use is how many people have actually read the privacy agreement when you agreed to use WhatsApp. You know, it's 21 pages long. The legalism behind it is so complex. The Gen Zs are already asking the question, I don't have to do that. I can use something else. And they will start to push back to the push back against the operators. So you will see more and more pushing and more, I would suspect, customized coding and customized privacy.
Perfect. This question is addressed to Sarah, but it kind of builds upon your answer there, Patrick. The question is, how can we ensure that misinformation does not keep thriving and being perpetuated when, you know, the newer generations are increasingly, let's say, dependent on social media, or if not dependent, at least increasing utilizers of it?
Well, we have to be careful when we focus on the younger generation as just by the virtue of being online, being more vulnerable to misinformation, when actually the biggest issue is generally for the population having more education on how to identify what is true and factual and what has been created for the purposes of misinforming the public. So what we actually see a lot of times is that, for example, older generations can potentially be more vulnerable to misinformation just simply by virtue of not having as much experience in the online communities. But as far as Gen Z is concerned, it's really about being able to educate youth and educate the public generally on how to look at a news article or a post and be able to think to themselves, you know, I can't just feed into this because it's reflecting my views or reflecting my values. I need to be able to look at this critically and be able to identify any red flags. We actually have one of the most fundamental structured analytic techniques is a quality of information check. And realistically, as human beings who are consuming information online through news, in person, it's actually really important to get those skills of looking at a source and being able to figure out, is this something that I can trust, or is this something that I should question? And so I think the focus really should be more on education itself necessarily than worrying about the people who are creating it online, because we do our best to police the online communities. Laws are consistently trying to catch up with society and the different ways in which people can spread information. So there's only so much we can do in that way. And what really should be focused on that is accessible to all of us is educating each other.
I personally found that to be a really fascinating conjunction between, you know, your response and Patrick's response regarding privacy, education, kind of youth's, you know, nexus at, nexus within, so, you know, social media and kind of digitization. So thank you very much. We've come to the end of our Q&A session. Unfortunately, I'd like to continue for a great deal longer. This is a real pleasure for me, and thank you very much to all the speakers. I'll now pass back to Natalie to close our session out.
Thank you. I see some really interesting Q&A responses, not just questions. So thank you all for being engaged there, as well as with our panelists. Thank you all for attending today. It was a really insightful and productive discussion panel. And I think we got some fantastic insights about the tangible impacts of COVID-19 on both Canada and the rest of the world, the shift in the international status quo, and how the emerging generation might change the world. I'd also like to thank the Regeneration contributing authors who were able to join us today. Thank you for your time. And if you would like to read the full Regeneration report, it is now live on the CASIS Vancouver website, and we will be posting a link shortly. Be sure to attend the next CIC event, as well as the CASIS Vancouver monthly digital roundtable, which will be on July 16th with Brett Widoff on the West Coast strategic priorities in the context of the Royal Canadian Navy. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thanks, everybody.